Hey, hello everybody. I'm going to tell you about the nitrogen cycle. I didn't give this as part of your jigsaw because the nitrogen cycle is so complex. There's a lot of chemistry in this. So I'm going to explain this. You should fill out the notes on your jigsaw paper. So other people have done the water cycle, the phosphorus cycle, the carbon cycle. Now you write down notes on the nitrogen cycle. You may want to write some additional notes as well, which you can use a piece of binder paper. And you can also look in your book to get more details. So let's get started. First of all, there is a cast of characters that we have to go through because it, nitrogen atoms have to bond with other molecules to be stable. And so there's different names for each of these different molecules. So there is nitrogen gas, there's ammonium, which is NH4 plus, there's nitrite, NO2 minus, and there is nitrate, NO3 minus. So I will, for the most part, call them by their names rather than their chemical formulas. And so one thing you need to know is nitrogen is a limiting factor. Limiting factors reduce population growth. So there is not enough nitrogen in the soil for plants to take up. And because it limits plant populations, that means it also limits consumer populations because the consumers are dependent on those plants. This is actually why we put nitrogen in fertilizer because there's usually not enough nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. Those are the main components of fertilizer. So this is really kind of a strange thing because 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen gas, N2. So when you take a breath in, the vast majority of what you're breathing in is nitrogen gas, but it's not a usable form for living things. So you breathe it in, you breathe it right out. It's surrounding plants, but they can't use it. So luckily, there are ways that nitrogen gas gets changed into other more usable forms of nitrogen. One of them is what's called abiotic fixation. Abiotic means a non-living. So that's lightning, and you can see that in this picture right here. Lightning can turn nitrogen gas into nitrous oxide and nitrogen dioxide. So the thing is, there's not a whole lot of lightning around, so it doesn't change a whole lot of nitrogen gas. Certainly not enough for all living things to depend on this. But luckily, there's another way that nitrogen gas can change into usable forms. It's called nitrogen fixation, and it's right here in the soil. There are bacteria in the soil that can turn nitrogen gas into a more usable form called ammonium. So, ammonium, plants can take in a little bit of ammonium, but too much is harmful for them. So, but no problem because, see, there are other forms of bacteria that can turn that ammonium into more usable forms. So, it turns it into first nitrite and then into nitrite is not usable. It's actually toxic to plants, but there's other bacteria that can turn that nitrite into nitrate. And here it is on the picture. This is a very usable form of nitrogen. Plants can assimilate that. That means take it in and use it in their cells. And then how does it get into the animals? The animals eat the plants, and then they use the nitrogen. So then everything produces waste products and eventually dies. So what happens to those? They become ammonium. So then this is ammonification right here. That ammonium can either be taken into the plants or it can be changed into more usable forms by these nitrifying bacteria. Finally, there's something called denitrification. That's where bacteria, this happens in waterlogged soils like in wetlands, they can turn nitrites and nitrates into nitrogen gas. So it goes back out into the atmosphere and then it can go back into this nitrogen cycle through either lightning or through these nitrogen fixing bacteria. Now, here is what I would have you do in class if we were actually in class together. There's a chart, we take some notes on it. So this is following the whole thing. I've got it written the opposite, the circle going in the opposite direction. So abiotic fixation with lightning, but more likely nitrogen gas is fixed by bacteria in the soil, turns it into ammonium. Ammonium is then turned into more usable forms. Well, some ammonium can be taken in by plants, not much. Most of it goes into the nitrification. So other bacteria turn that ammonium into first nitrites, which are toxic, and then nitrates, which are very usable to plants. The nitrates go into the plants, which then the animals eat, and then everything dies and produces waste products. So what happens? That goes into ammonification. And so those waste products and dead things decay, and the bacteria turn it into ammonium, back to nitrification and denitrification. Bacteria in waterlogged soil turns it into nitrogen gas, which comes back out here. Now, if we were in the classroom, I would also have a demonstration going in 3 tanks, and one of them has bacteria for the nitrogen cycle. Another one has plants, which you can just see. They're floating in the top. You can barely see it in this picture. And another one has fish. Now, when the water is not cycling between these tanks, I want you to think what would happen. We'll start with the fish. I would feed them a little bit of fish food, and they digest that food, and what do they make? They make ammonium as a waste product. If nothing is breaking down that ammonium, it builds up and it eventually will kill the fish. Now, what's happening in the middle tank with the plants? They don't have a nitrogen source. They need 2 things, either ammonium or nitrates. Otherwise, they can't make their amino acids and they'll die. And then in here, there's rocks at the bottom just as a surface for the bacteria to grow on. Those are all the bacteria, many different types involved in the nitrogen cycle. And they don't have a source of nitrogen. So, well, they can get a little bit out of the atmosphere, but they're at the bottom of the water. Somehow they need a nitrogen source that they can start converting from one form of nitrogen to another. When water's not cycling from one tank to another, none of these are going to be sustained. In a short time, everything's going to die. But I I would run it for a couple of days on their own. Don't worry, the fish don't die. And then I would start pumping the water from the fish tank up to the bacteria. And what had the fish produced? Ammonium. That gets pumped up to the bacteria tank. What do the bacteria do? They turn that ammonium first into nitrites and then into nitrates. That cascades down into the middle tank. What do the plants do? They can't use nitrites, but they can use either ammonium or nitrates. And they grow, and eventually animals would eat them. And then this water cascades down and it's nice clean water. The fish produce more ammonium, which the bacteria convert to more usable forms, and the plants take in. It's a cycle. The bacteria is dependent on the plants and the animals, and the plants are dependent on the bacteria, and the animals are dependent on the plants. All right, I hope this explains the nitrogen cycle. Feel free to go back, listen to what you need to, pause as you're writing. All right, I'll see you in class.